Good morning. I am Michael Pascual. I'm currently working and living here in the Middle East, which is the Qatar. For today, I'm going to present about an informational interview with Daniel Perdon. So, the interview revolves around Daniel working for Aboriginal Australians in the outback Australia. We're gonna talk about like a brief introduction regarding myself and also for Daniel, how I met Daniel, and who is Daniel Perdon and his experiences and background working with Aboriginal Australians. And we also talk about the Australia's healthcare system, or namely the NDIS, and his involvement with NDIS and why I chose him to get interviewed. So, so again, I am Michael Ray Pascual. I'm currently employed in the Middle East as an occupational therapy working in the school system. During pandemic way back 2020, I was stranded in Australia for a year because I was unable to return to the Middle East because of the borders are closed. I was forced to stay in Australia and look for a job. I got a job offer working as a community occupational therapist in Queensland, Australia, serving pediatrics and geriatric population. During those time, it's like I was trying to understand the system, particularly how the National Disability Insurance Scheme or NDIS works and how I assist my clients in accessing the NDIS. During my first few weeks at work, I was really struggling because I don't know how to navigate the NDIS, how to evaluate or assess my clients using the NDIS because at the end of it, it's like you have to send a report and then the NDIS will either approve it or not. So how I met Daniel Perdon. So during that time, it's like I didn't have any supervisor to look for it, and then my boss were not a therapist, but they also have experiences working in the disability sector. So I sought assistance through the Facebook groups called NDIS OT providers. So that is where I first encountered him. For the record, I did not meet him personally, but we talked on Facebook. So he served as my mentor as I went through the NDIS. So, who is Daniel Perdon? Daniel is also a Filipino occupational therapist. He is currently working as a community occupational therapist in Mount Isa, Queensland. Mount Isa is a city founded as a result of the large mineral riches discovered in this area. Technically, there are no medical facilities available in the community. He is working in outback Australia, serving the Aboriginal Australians or Indigenous Australians population. What interesting about his work is like he travels weekly by air and by land. His company arranged for flights, travel expenses, and lodging. He advocates for Aboriginal access to NDIS funding, which is subsidized by the state and the federal government. His occupational therapy began in the Philippines and subsequently moved to the United States and Australia. His experiences includes working in a remote area, skilled nursing facility, and regional hospital throughout the Northern Territory, New South Wales, and Queensland in Australia. I mentioned about NDIS. What is NDIS? NDIS is known as National Disability Insurance Scheme. So, this is like Australia's first national scheme for people with disability. It is technically provides funding directly to individuals. In my experiences, I met a lot of clients who have fundings from NDIS, and they can choose whoever or whenever or wherever they want to do the therapy. So I'm not really sure about in the U.S. healthcare system, but the NDIS provides free therapy for Australians. So there are actually 4.3 million Australians who have disability, and then what NDIS wants to achieve is to provide all these Australians with disability to have an access by the NDIS funding. Daniel is was involved in NDIS trial. He works at the Office of Disability in Northern Territory, and then he used to be an OT consultant on the NDIS model development. So a few years ago, so the Australian government was trying to develop a model, which is now called NDIS, to support Australians who have disability. So he has a first-hand knowledge of how the NDIS works and its transition from Medicare to NDIS. So I'm not really sure in the US healthcare system, but in Australia they have a universal healthcare where um, access to healthcare system is free. So there are a lot of things I learned from my interview with Daniel. So Daniel mentioned that when he worked with Aboriginal Australians, so he became aware about the cultural distinction and challenges. So he also mentioned that it's like you are not permitted to look them in the eye, especially for Aboriginal Australians. So it is deemed impolite by the majority of them. So they also have a different language other than English, and some may require an interpreter or translator. So most of them, they also prefer women to be a therapist, especially if the client is female. So he also mentioned, like Daniel mentioned, that if a family died in the house, it is customary not to return because it violates their values and customs. So this is also where the NDIS comes in to assist them in locating a transitional home. So yeah, so um, Daniel works includes assessing various activities of daily living in the community, such as shower assessment, facilitates home adaptation and modification, and community assessment and intervention. So these assessment or intervention or adaptations are generally free, and it is funded by the NDIS. So the Aboriginal Australians don't need to pay anything, as in zero. I chose Daniel Perdon as my interviewee. So, as an occupational therapist working in Qatar, I intend to settle permanently in Australia, and I'm also interested working in an outback Australia or in the rural Australia, working with marginalized population and also working with Aboriginal Australians. So I've always been fascinated by the possibility of working with them, and it's also a great opportunity to explore my research interests for my capstone project. And additionally, so this is also a good way to learn more about the NDIS system, and for the future, if I want to establish a clinic, it will be helpful for me to know how the NDIS works. So frankly speaking, is like 2 years ago I struggled navigating the NDIS. So I resigned after 4 months and moved back here in Qatar. So yeah. So thank you for listening and good night.